Good morning. Well, it's great to be with you this morning, and we're back for a few weeks. We've been based in India since January, and we like the weather here. It's kind of like India weather, so we feel very at home when we came back at this time. This morning, we're going to be doing it a little bit different. We're going to tag team preach. We've never done that before, and I don't know if the church normally does that, but we're going to try it this morning. So I'm going to share a little bit, and then Steve will come up and share. The subject this morning is the faithfulness of God, or the fruit of the Spirit, faithfulness. And so as I was thinking and praying about this, I was thinking, we are so blessed that we as followers of Jesus get to know a God who is 100% faithful. He is faithful to every one of His promises. When we hear those words that He will not leave us nor forsake us, that He is always with us, when He says, "Do not fear, for I am with you," they are true. He means it. He is not moved by our moods or His moods. He is consistent. He is always 100% steadfast. He is a rock, and we get to know Him. You see, I'm passionate about this, and I was thinking a lot of our adult years, Steve and I, we lived amongst people that don't know this God. We lived amongst people that their God, they have to do a lot of work in order to be able to be accepted. They don't have a God that they can count on that is faithful. It's about how much they can do, how many times they pray, how much they can have a sacrifice when they get a new car, when they get a new house. They pray to the God of disaster that their disaster won't come to their house. They're scared. But we get to live in the reality that our God is forever faithful. You see, as I was thinking about this message, and as I was praying and just reminded of God's faithfulness in my life. And I want to encourage you this morning that you would reflect back on times when you have seen God's faithfulness. We went to India in 1982, a long time ago, and we were zealous and excited. We thought we're going to go and we're going to see people start coming to the Lord, and we're going to establish schools, and we had all kinds of big dreams and visions. And then about, I don't know, maybe a few months later, reality set in. It didn't happen like that. It was hard. People didn't know who we were. They said, "What are you talking about? Who are you?" And so our first agenda was we were going to start a school, a mission training school for Indians. And so we went out and we started knocking on church doors. We went and met pastors, and we tried to share the gospel with different people. Not a lot of response. Finally, we got 12 students, and we were so excited. The problem was we didn't have a place, and it was 2 days before it was going to begin. And so we were reminded again that God said, "I'm not going to leave you. I'm not going to forsake you." 2 days before the school was to start, a pastor called us, and he says, "I have an old mission compound an hour outside of Kolkata. You can use that one." We went and saw it, and it was okay. It was messy, but we thought we can clean it. So 2 days before the school was going to begin, we went out, we went to the city, we bought brooms and buckets and different things to clean. We got back on the train. We had been in an all-night prayer meeting, so we were really tired on the train. And we fell asleep. And as we were just about entering or leaving our platform, somebody woke us up and said, "Isn't this your platform?" And we said, "Yes." And so we jumped out of the train. Now, we didn't know how to jump out of a moving train. We have learned that now. And that has helped us in many situations. But those days we didn't. And so what we did is we all ended up, we were like 10 people laying on the platform of this train, spread out. And one was holding a bucket, and one was holding a plunger, and I was at one end, and I thought, we looked so stupid. We looked foolish. And I thought, here we are, we've come to kind of bring, the gospel to India. And here we looked so weak. And it was at that time that God spoke to me and he said, Liz, I want you always to remember this picture. He said, I want you to know that in your weakness, I will be faithful and I will be strong. And then that school started. About 3 weeks in, we didn't have many finances. And so we got news that we were going to get a check. The check was going to be like $200. Those days, that was a lot of money. But those days, no ATM, no credit card. What you did is you had to go to the bank and you had to get your money through the bank from a bank transfer. So Steve went to the bank, showed him his passport, and they said, oh, sir, I think this is the wrong Steve Cochrane. There's not that many Steve Cochranes in Calcutta. And they said, because on the check, there is no E at the end of Cochrane. It must be the wrong person. We're going to send the check back. Well, that check, it takes 2 weeks to go back in those days, and then they have to correct it, and then it takes 2 more weeks. And so we got the news, and I was so discouraged. And again, God reminded me, and he said, Liz, I've not called you to do great big things or not to worry about that. What I've called you to is to be faithful. You do the next thing that I want you to do and consistently be faithful. You see, the Bible says in 2 Timothy, and today, just to thank God, our ministry is like we have maybe 2,900 people. We have over 200 locations. We have many schools and properties, and so much has happened since those early years. But it's because of God's faithfulness. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13, it says that God cannot deny himself. His character will always be faithful. He's not going to change. Even when you and I are not faithful, he is faithful. And so, as this morning we think of the fruit of the Spirit, and we think about the terrible shootings that has happened, and in Hong Kong right now, the protests, and Pakistan and India, so many things that are going on that are so disturbing to our soul. Our faith needs to be reminded that we put our faith in the faithful one. And you see, because of his faithfulness, we can be faithful. And I think that God doesn't want us just to have a bunch of legalism and be, trying to do good works and try in our own strength to be faithful. But as you get to know him and his faithfulness, we automatically want to obey him. You see, faithful means that you're full of faith. You believe God 100% and his word, and we trust him. And then we want to obey him. We want to do what he tells us to, because this book is full of the wisest things in the world. And so we want to obey God, and we want to fulfill what he tells us to do. Faithfulness means that we continually do the right thing again and again, over and over. And as we are faithful with the little things, then he begins to do things beyond what we can imagine. About 2 or 3 months ago, I was in Dubai, and we were running a school there, and I met with one of our leaders who comes from a Muslim background, from a Muslim nation. And for security, I'm going to change his name. I'm not going to tell you the country. And he said, Liz, my life is so exciting. I'm so blessed to know Jesus. And I said, well, how did you come to know Jesus? I didn't know the story. And he said, I want to thank God for a very consistent missionary. He said, this missionary was so faithful. He said, I went to the capital of my country. I was a full Muslim, and I wanted to be a doctor. But he said, I'd always heard about Christianity, and so I thought, I'm going to read this Bible and find out what it is that is so bad that I hear about that's not good. Then I can tell people. And he said, I started in Genesis. I didn't know where else to start. And I went to Revelation, and I read it. He said, some of it didn't make sense at all. But this missionary said, if you want, I will meet you every week, and I can try to explain it. He said, it took me 4 years. And he said the faithfulness of that missionary, who had not seen a lot of fruit, he said, was something that helped to change my life. And he said, after 4 years, I read John chapter 10, and it says, my sheep will know my voice. And he said, I don't know the voice of God, and I want to receive God. And he chose that day against the wish of his family. He comes from a family with 16 siblings. His dad has 2 wives. That's normal where he comes from. And he gave his life to Jesus. Then he joined one of our schools. His life began to change. And he said, now God has allowed me to be one of the leaders in this country. And he said, Liz, we are seeing hundreds of Muslims coming to know God. And he said, I never would have had that faithful missionary not help me month by month. And he said, now, can you please help me? Because we are trying to make apps. He said, there's so many people coming to the Lord, we don't know how to help them all. But my point is that as we continue to learn about the faithfulness of God, as we get to know the God of this Bible and his faithfulness, then God will help us to be continually faithful in areas in relationships, in areas in all different parts of our life. Because as we are faithful and do the small things, the faithful things that God does, I have testimony that I can say that God is faithful. And now I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
For those of you that know us, not all of you do, you would maybe be a little bit nervous that the two of us are preaching on the same morning. But I just want you to have hope because the second service started on time. That should tell you something. And those of you that don't know us, you didn't even care anyway because you don't know us. But hopefully you'll get to know us, we'll get to know you. Also, the preaching clock, I'm going to give away a secret of the church. Is that okay? Since almost none of the staff are here, I can give this secret away. There is a preaching clock back there. And I've said this before, some people haven't believed me, and it actually counts down, okay? So when we knew we both were preaching, I asked Pastor Michael a couple weeks ago, I said, Pastor Michael, would you be willing just for this one Sunday to turn off the clock? And, he said because he knows us very well, he said no. He said, I will make it bigger. I guess because he doubted that our eyesight, we're not that much older than him, but the eyesight issue. So my wife did fantastic, so we're relaxed about time, amen? And I don't mean that I'm going to go over, I just mean we're relaxed about the time. Faithfulness. This is part 2. And, when we did hear the news last night, following it all day yesterday about El Paso and then waking up to Dayton, and, the thought does run through your mind, should we just change the message? Should we just say something else? I was in Sri Lanka a few years ago. I've been probably, 25, 30 times in my life to Sri Lanka. And I was there a few years ago when the war was still going on, the Civil War, and the morning I was to preach at a church, not far away from there was a terrorist bombing so bad that I heard it where I was staying. And I went to the church, and before it started, I said to the pastor, Pastor, do you not even want me to preach? Your people need comfort, and I'm a guest preacher. Do you want to preach? And he said, no, just preach what God gave you, and we'll trust him for that. And so I did, and it was, I guess, the right word. And so today, really though, as we think about faithfulness, when we think about what we need in our own lives, what we need as a nation, as a world, faithfulness is certainly a message that resounds. And we've been looking the last few weeks, if you've been around, at Galatians 5, verses 22 and 23, which is the list of the fruit of the Spirit. And I'm not going to read them again this morning, but one of those that we're talking about today is faithfulness. But I do want to go a few verses earlier, and I want to read verse 16, because I think this is a key verse that Paul gives. Paul, the author is the Apostle Paul, who wrote several letters in the New Testament, had a deep concern for the church that met in a place called Galatia, which was also a province as well as a local, more localized place. And here's what he said, it writes in verse 16 of Galatians 5. And I'm reading this in the Amplified Bible. If you're not aware of the Amplified, it brings in a bit more of the, in this case, the Greek. It's a little bit longer than your translation might be, so don't worry, it's not very long. But I say, walk and live habitually in the Holy Spirit. Walk and live in the Spirit, responsive to, controlled, and guided by the Spirit. Then you will certainly not gratify the cravings and desires of the flesh, of human nature without God. And then Paul goes on to talk about the works of the flesh, and then he comes to the fruit of the Spirit. And it's really important for us to understand not only about faithfulness, but about all the fruit of the Spirit. It is not a moral code. It's not a list of outward actions that we're meant to live up to. It is meant to come from within us. Because we are believers in Jesus Christ. We have said to Jesus, there is no other hope in the world and in my life except what you have done on the cross for me. So as we give ourselves to Jesus, the Spirit of God lives within us, doesn't make us robots, we're still us, but He lives within us. And so from inside us, this fruit is lived out. The Spirit within us, with our spirit, lives it out outside. It's not an ethical code. It's not just being moral. It's not more of morality we need in our nation. It's the fruit of the Spirit lived from within God's people and resulting in outward change. The fruit of the Spirit in us and through us, it really mirrors God's character. And we've been talking all morning and singing about God's character. Great is His faithfulness. Because every one of these fruits of the Spirit mirrors the character of the living God. He is all these things. In verse 22 and 23, that's God's character. It's not just that we're meant to be like that. He is like that. And because He's like that, we can be like that. We need to get to know His character. In Psalm 89, and we're not going to turn to that, but if you get a chance later today or sometime this week, remember Psalm 89. Because in Psalm 89, there's 52 verses there. And almost a third of those verses, 15 verses, deal with either faithfulness or steadfast love, which is a word very similar in the Hebrew to faithfulness. Now, if you add up all those references, some of them are about God's faithfulness, and some of them are about our faithfulness. In that case, in Psalms, the psalmist or God's people, Israel. Because these things very much work together. God's faithfulness, our faithfulness. And let me give you a quote. Now, I'm nervous. I said in the first service, I'm nervous about quotes. If you were here last week, Pastor Michael didn't give a couple quotes because he was nervous about the people, had they actually said it. Do you remember that if you were here last week? So that puts a lot of pressure on the speaker the following week. I've got a couple of Mother Teresa quotes coming up, and I had to really wonder, did she really say this? Because even though Michael's not here, he might listen to the message. But this quote is from me. Are you ready? Now, I know I said this. Although when you get to be somebody as old as I am, you have a lot of quotes in your mind, and you start saying quotes that are not your own quotes. But this is my quote. I wrote this week. Now, with all that lead up, it's probably not even going to be that good. But as our revelation of God's character, quality of faithfulness grows, the fruit of the Spirit in us of faithfulness will also grow. Now, I think that's so good, I'm going to say it again, whether you don't think it is or not. As our revelation, not just our knowledge, our revelation of God's character, quality of faithfulness grows, as that revelation grows, the fruit of the Spirit in us of faithfulness will also grow. The more you get to know God, the more you know His love, His faithfulness, His gentleness, His goodness, all of these qualities, the more you know them. And unfortunately, I hate to tell you this morning that the place we usually get to know these is in the hard times. I wish it was in the easy times that we get to know the character of God. But just as we heard Brendan say this morning, it's in the times when the Babylonians have your city surrounded. Talking of your own life, of course, not Gig Harbor. But it's in those times when we get to know God's faithfulness. As this fruit of faithfulness grows in us, we really need to hear God sometimes affirm that we are faithful. Do you ever just need God to say, hey, I love you, you're faithful? And usually that comes from other people. And in Matthew 25, verse 23, many of us would know the verse when Jesus says, telling a parable of the master and the servant and the talents. Jesus says this in Matthew 25:23, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in a little, I will put you in charge of much. Now, we love to use those verses at funerals, memorials. Maybe even they go on a gravestone. And the people have gone on, and I don't know what your theology is after death, but I'm not sure how much we get to listen to when we're gone. And people say incredible things at memorial services about people. Have you been there? I don't mean you've been there dead. I mean you've been there alive. Yeah? We don't have any dead people, I don't think, this morning. But we need to say those things before people die. I said it to somebody I was sitting next to today. It could have been my wife, but there was somebody else sitting next to me, and I said to them at the end of the service, I said, brother, because I've known this guy for 30 years, and I said, brother, you fit this message. You have been faithful in the little. We need to say it to people before they go. My wife Liz's mom is from Sweden, and Liz was born in Sweden as well. And we got to be 2 weeks ago at Liz's mom's 80th birthday celebration. She's turning 80 next month, but we had it because all the Swedish relatives could come together. We had it a couple of weeks ago, and it was amazing because we could tell this dear woman who has lived out this message of faithfulness, we could tell her to her face, before she's dead, you are faithful. You are a faithful woman. And it was amazing to be able to be there. I was just sitting there that night of the party, and I'm just going, God, thank you, I can be here. And this woman is alive in front of me. And I can say to her how faithful she's been. Yesterday, I did see on Facebook a gravestone of somebody who we both know named Peter. And he passed away a couple of weeks ago. He was from a leader in our mission. And this was what was written on his gravestone. Peter was a man who loved God, loved his family, and loved the nations. Peter was a man who loved God, loved his family, and loved the nations. I'd love that on my gravestone there, if you could arrange that. But in about 25 years from now, hopefully, or more. And last of all this morning, walking in the fruit of the Spirit of faithfulness, it also presents challenges to us. It's not easy to walk in the fruit of the Spirit. It presents resistances sometimes. There's resistances inside us. There's works of the flesh that you can read just before this passage. There's things that other people cause difficulties. It's not easy to walk in this way, but I just want to bring out two areas to us this morning. First of all, our speech. Wow, we live in a nation right now where whatever political party you are, all the political parties, all the level of discourse, of speech is so low, it's so bad. Things that are said to one another. And thinking of the fruit of the Spirit, I was thinking this week, if you put each of the fruit of the Spirit along what comes out of our mouths, it's a great test. Is our speech loving? Is our speech full of joy? Is our speech peace-giving? Is our speech patient? Is our speech kind? Is our speech good? Is our speech faithful? Gentle? Is our speech self-controlled? And our speech is an area, and I know in my life, where faithfulness, am I true in what I'm saying? And we can look all day, we can look at other people out there somewhere on social media or in our nation, and we can condemn their speech, but what about us? What about us this morning, in your own families, in my family? And the other area that we need to be faithful in, I totally forgot. I also want to show one of these Mother Teresa quotes. Can we still get that up here? Be faithful in small things, because it is in them that your strength lies. And faithfulness in our speech may be a small thing. Faithfulness in the other area I'll mention today, which is our attitude toward other people, and especially our enemies. These might be small things. Somebody said to me at the break between services, well, really, are there any small things? Or does God see everything as a big thing? As a small thing? I don't know. I don't know how God looks at it. But Mother Teresa, this woman, we got to meet her twice. She prayed for our older daughter. Some of you have heard our stories about Mother Teresa. Liz shared about Calcutta in the early years. I lived there for 4 years in Calcutta. But as we treat even people that would be our enemies, are we faithful to love? A nation that our own nation probably considers an enemy more than any other nation is the nation of Iran. And of course, Iran is in the news again. Interestingly enough, inside Iran, people report that the Church of Jesus Christ in Iran is growing probably faster than any church in the world except China. There are many, many Christians now inside Iran. I was just with a couple of them at the beginning of the year. Precious people. I was in Central Asia helping lead a leadership training program. We had Iranians in that school, and I got to love them and know them so deeply. I'm praying I can go there next year by God's grace. And I'm leaving in 2 weeks to go to Nepal and India and train Indians and Nepalis in reaching Iranians. Now, you might not say Iran's your enemy this morning, but what do you need to be faithful to love an enemy today? Someone that is perceived as that you're in conflict with. Maybe someone you're not even speaking to. Faithfulness involves these things. Let's see one last Mother Teresa quote, and then we have some questions for you like we usually do. Now, I do know she said this, so Pastor Michael, if you ever listen to this message, Mother Teresa did say this. God didn't call me to be successful. He called me to be faithful. Faithfulness is from the inside. It results in outward actions that can bring change. But sometimes it's viewed as success in the world, and sometimes it is not viewed as success. Because we are not called to be people who are successes. We are called to be people who are faithful. And faithfulness and the fruit of the Spirit, that will change the situations around us. We long to be faithful. I long to be faithful. But let me just say in closing, this faithfulness is not done by an act of our own will. It's not done by an act of our own moral strength. It's done by the Spirit of God working within us. Let's look at these questions this morning. 3 questions for us to just think about. We're just going to spend a couple of moments. What is one way God has shown His faithfulness to you this past week? And it may be in a very hard time. Maybe even yesterday, when you heard this news, you were just cast again into grief and almost, when is this ever going to end? And sometimes God has to show His faithfulness to us just by coming and saying again, I will be faithful. I am God. What area of your life right now are you hearing God's affirmation? Maybe it's coming directly from the Spirit within you. Maybe it's just somebody who loves you, who's saying something to you right now. What area are you hearing? Well done. good and faithful servant. And just to add to this question, maybe we need to just tell somebody today or in the next week, tell somebody you love how they've been faithful, like I did this morning. Do that. Let's do it before we get to our memorial services. Amen? And 3, what is the greatest challenge or area of resistance that you face? We talked about speech. We talked about attitude, loving our enemies. What do you face as a challenge to live out this fruit of faithfulness? What is it in your life that resists this fruit? And if you identify in any of these areas, just bring these to the Lord. But close your eyes if that helps you to focus, and just spend a couple of minutes with Jesus, letting the Lord speak to you in any way He would want to.